There's a place called Indian Point. It's an unsafe nuclear joint, threatens everybody, and it poisons everything. It's first on a public safety list. It's a target for a terrorist. We have a chance to shut it down.
My name's Alfred Meyer, and I'm a volunteer with Physicians for Social Responsibility, the New York chapter. And today we'll have a conversation with Kevin Kamps, who's the radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear. Today let's talk about Indian Point, the two nuclear reactors located about 35 miles from where we're sitting in New York City. These are making electricity on the edges of the Hudson River. But just recently, there have been tremendous spikes in the leakage of radioactive hydrogen called tritium. Can you tell us what's going on up at the Indian Point nuclear reactor site?
There have been leaks of radioactive water at Indian Point for a long time, for years, even over a decade. And one source of leakage was, frighteningly enough, the high-level radioactive waste storage pools at Indian Point have leaked radioactivity into the groundwater, and then into the Hudson River. So this isn't anything new, unfortunately, but what just happened recently is a very large spike in tritium concentrations in monitoring wells. There's a whole series of dozens of monitoring wells across the site to try to keep tabs on how bad the leakage is, and one of those monitoring wells, as documented by Governor Cuomo himself in a press statement, showed an increase from one day to the next of something like 65,000% in tritium levels.
That's a big increase.
Another way of saying that is a 650-fold increase in tritium levels.
Do we have any idea what's caused that?
Apparently the failure of a sump pump during a refueling outage recently. So I think there's still a lot of questions to be answered about where this tritium is coming from and where it's going. And Governor Cuomo has ordered several state agencies to look into this matter. And again, this is just the latest of a long series of incidents and accidents and mishaps and breakdowns at Indian Point just in the last year. I happened to be speaking at Stony Point Conference Center near Indian Point in May of 2015. There was a gathering of concerned citizens and environmental groups discussing the decommissioning of nuclear power plants and the hoped for and needed decommissioning of these very risky reactors and radioactive waste storage at Indian Point, so close to New York City. You know, if you go in a radius of 50 miles around Indian Point, you have at least 20 million people who live and or work in that area. It's the biggest concentration of people around a nuclear power plant in the entire United States. So the safety risks, the security risks that represents. And just days after, there was a transformer fire at Indian Point, so pretty dramatic black smoke pouring out of the nuclear power plant, which during the firefighting activities related to that resulted in releases to the river, unfortunately. And so there has been this long string of problems at Indian Point.
Sounds like it's a troubled facility, and curiously enough, or perhaps frighteningly enough, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a list of those reactor sites most at risk of earthquake activity. And Indian Point is at the top of that list. So we have these two reactors at the junction of two different earthquake fault lines.
Indian Point was built a long time ago. Indian Point Unit 1 was actually built in the 1960s and has been long shut down, thankfully. But Indian Point Units 2 and 3, the two newer reactors, are themselves over 40 years old. And in fact, Unit 2 and Unit 3 are now operating on expired permits because the initial operating permits granted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are for 40 years. And unfortunately, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has rubber stamped around 75 license extensions to reactors in the United States. They give a whopping 20 extra years on top of the original 40 for a total of 60 years of operations. But there's been tremendous resistance to these license extensions at Indian Point. The New York Attorney General's office, groups like Riverkeeper and Clearwater and others, Indian Point Safe Energy, coalition have fought these license extensions, and it's now a record-breaking duration of a battle. So it's going on a decade that these license extensions have been fought by these opponents, so much so that the old permits expired. And now the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is allowing both reactors to operate on expired permits until this contested license extension proceeding is resolved.
Meanwhile, all of New York, the greater metropolitan area, is at risk. And this is what quite baffles me is we don't need the electricity from Indian Point. New York City is not going to go dark. The elevators are not going to quit running. The subway system won't stop running. We don't have to have Indian Point running. Yet, should there be some catastrophe there, this would conceivably require the evacuation of 20 million people from this area. So it seems really ill-advised that we'd be taking such a huge risk for the potential of catastrophe.
Well, you have the safety risks at a very old nuclear power plant. So it's over 40 years old, and engineers refer to this as the breakdown phase. So systems are breaking down. We're seeing that at Indian Point almost once a month. They're having breakdowns of various sorts out there.
Months.
In addition to the safety risks of a geriatric nuclear power plant, you've also got the security risks. And I just reviewed a report written by Dr. Ed Lyman at Union of Concerned Scientists that he put out in 2004, 3 years after the attacks of 9/11 on New York City. It's entitled Chernobyl on the Hudson, and again, this was written in 2004, so 7 years before Fukushima, or, you know, in terms of safety risks, you could think of it as Fukushima on the Hudson. But this was looking at security risks specifically. And what Dr. Lyman documented was that the 9/11 Commission report at the federal level documented that Al-Qaeda had considered attacking Indian Point. One thing Al-Qaeda believed was that there was a no-fly zone over nuclear power plants. It turns out not to have been true. So partially through sheer luck, they decided not to attack Indian Point because Dr. Lyman put some numbers down in his report using official government computer models. One of them is called CRAC-2, ironically enough, Calculation of Reactor Accident Consequences. It's a model used by Sandia National Lab in New Mexico to look at catastrophic radioactivity releases at atomic reactors. But what if those releases are caused by an intentional attack, is what Dr. Lyman was looking at. And the figures that he generated from this computer calculation were quite shocking. If there were to be a successful terrorist attack on Indian Point, there could be up to 44,000 acute radiation poisoning deaths. These are near-term deaths caused by exposure to high-level radioactivity. In terms of latent cancer fatalities, these could take years or decades to unfold in human bodies. We're talking over 500,000 latent cancer fatalities possible from this catastrophic radioactivity release. In terms of property damage, New York City has some pricey real estate, and so does the surrounding countryside in this area. And Dr. Lyman's figures were essentially $1 to $2 trillion in property damage. And again, this could happen due to an intentional attack at Indian Point, or it could happen due to an accident.
Let's talk a little bit about the tritium in the water, because this is a great threat to the watershed, both to drinking water for nearby communities as well as to the larger Hudson River. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen that would go into radioactive water, and human beings are around 50% water. And so this radioactivity as an internal emitter could be incorporated into 50% of our body.
Something that we experience all too often with nuclear utilities like Entergy, which owns Indian Point, but also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at the U.S. federal government level that's supposed to protect public health and safety and the environment from the hazards of nuclear power and radioactive waste, is deception and obfuscation. And this is very true with tritium. I have had an NRC commissioner say to my face that there is no nexus between health and safety and tritium leaks or spills or intentional releases into the environment. We don't believe that, actually. Tritium may be a mildly radioactive beta emitter, But that's external exposure. If you ingest tritium, whether it's in your drinking water or it's in the food that you eat because it's incorporated into the food chain and concentrated there, and this tritium goes wherever hydrogen goes in the human body, which is everywhere in the human body, right down to the DNA molecule, it can do tremendous damage at that level. And another deception is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the industry say, oh, tritium is not only mildly radioactive, but it passes through the human body relatively quickly. Unless it doesn't. There's a form of tritium called organically bound tritium, where it sets up residence in your body and it sticks around for a significant amount of time.
Just to review that if tritium is radioactive, it could be in the form of a radioactive water molecule. It could be released from a nuclear reactor in the form of steam, and then be in the water vapor. It could go whichever way the wind blows. It could then precipitate out as rain. It could fall onto your organic vegetable garden, and thereby the crops that you're so lovingly tending could actually be incorporating radioactive water into it that you then take into your body when you were to eat those plants.
A radioactive steam release that comes to mind at Indian Point happened in February of 2000. It was a steam generator tube rupture. And so granted, yet again, this was even before Entergy took over at Indian Point, but both the company that operated Indian Point at the time and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission downplayed the significance of the radioactive steam release because it was a small quantity of radioactive steam. But the much bigger issue was the potential for a reactor meltdown because of this incident. So if you blow a steam generator tube, you are taking a very big risk that you're going to have a cascading failure of multiple tubes. And if you fail enough tubes in a radioactive steam generator, you can actually lose cooling to the core of the reactor, and that can lead to a meltdown. And this was a classic example of this breakdown phase of old reactors. And this was 16 years ago at Indian Point. And so their steam generator tubes had grown very thin to the point of breaking, and one of them did. So it was a close call.
Well, suffice it to say that these facilities operate under very demanding circumstances, that the temperatures involved in the radioactive exposure to the components of these highly complex plants really puts so much at risk.
And Indian Point is called a pressurized water reactor, and that's another extreme condition besides the intense radioactivity, the very high temperatures, over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, that the cooling water is at in the core of this operating reactor and those steam generator tubes. You've also got, because it's a pressurized water reactor, you've got 2,200 pounds of pressure per square inch on the metals in the primary loop. And that's one of the issues that Governor Cuomo has pointed to as a reason that Indian Point has to be shut down, has to be retired, is the embrittlement of the reactor pressure vessel at Indian Point. And this is an issue I'm familiar with from another Entergy plant, another pressurized water reactor in Michigan called Palisades. So Palisades is already into uncharted territory of risk when it comes to this brittleness of the 8-inch thick reactor pressure vessel walls. They're that thick because they have to hold this tremendous pressure. But the neutron radiation coming off the core has poked microscopic holes like Swiss cheese in that metal. It's very brittle, and the same thing is happening at Indian Point. The year 2025 comes to mind as kind of a threshold at Indian Point, but they're already very embrittled at Indian Point. What could happen is if the emergency core cooling system gets turned on to cool down an overheating core, it could be like a hot glass under cold water, only at 2,200 pounds. That's a ton of pressure per square inch. What can happen is a through-wall crack can be driven through that 8-inch thick reactor pressure vessel wall. That liquid cooling water will instantly turn to steam, escape from the reactor pressure vessel. You have an uncovered core, which will then melt down. There's no contingency to prevent that. The meltdown could go through the bottom of the reactor pressure vessel, through the foundations of the containment building. It could escape into the environment. That's what has happened at Fukushima Daiichi. You could have a catastrophic radioactivity release, and again, those numbers are just off the charts bad.
As we know in Fukushima, if the wind had been blowing the other direction, Tokyo would have had to have been evacuated. And I would suggest that if Tokyo was evacuated, it would upend the world financial system. And that we're taking that same risk here in New York, operating Indian Point, that New York is a nerve center of the world financial system. To threaten its ongoing functioning seems to be very ill-advised.
Well, the Prime Minister of Japan, who served during the beginning of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear catastrophe, Naoto Kan, spoke in New York in late 2013, and he said publicly, as he had before, for about a year and a half before his speech here in New York, that he had secret contingency plans in the works for what his chief spokesman, the cabinet secretary, Adano, referred to as a demonic chain reaction of reactor meltdowns and pool fires. That's what they were facing in March of 2011. And yes, they did see 3 atomic reactors at Fukushima Daiichi melt down with catastrophic radioactivity releases to the environment that continue to this day. Lesser levels than in March and April of 2011, but they're still releasing radioactivity. This is 5 years on now. So what Khan admitted to that day was that if Tokyo had been evacuated, that's 35 million people. If all of Northeast Japan had been evacuated, that's 50 million people. What they were worried about was not just 3 reactors at Daiichi, but another 4 reactors melting down just 8 miles south at Fukushima Daini, which survived this catastrophe by a single off-site power line. That's why those 4 reactors didn't melt down. But in addition to the reactors melting down, the pools catching on fire was an even bigger worry. And that was because the pools are not located in a radioactive containment structure. And the same is true here in the United States. They were worried about multiple pools going up in flames, releasing mega catastrophic amounts of radioactivity into the environment.
And is it true that there's more used nuclear fuel that is terribly hot in temperature and radioactivity, but there's more spent nuclear fuel at Indian Point than there was at Fukushima?
The high-level radioactive waste storage pool risks in the United States, including at Indian Point, are much worse than those same risks in Japan, because in Japan, fuel is taken out of the pools and it's shipped to another place. But here in the United States, the pools are kept as full as possible as a money-saving measure, because they have the pools. They've been built decades ago. And they take full advantage of these pools, and they remove as little waste as they can from those pools, just enough to make enough room that they can keep operating these reactors. Because when a reactor refuels, an old, used, spent, no longer useful, highly radioactive nuclear fuel comes out of that operating reactor, they have to put it in the pool for 5 years for thermal cooling and radioactive decay. And after that point, it can come out of the pool and go into outdoor dry cask storage, which they also have going on at Indian Point, right on the banks of the Hudson River. So the pools are full in the United States, so much so that the density of the fuel in the pool is approaching that of an operating reactor core. The only problem being there is not 8-inch thick steel reactor pressure vessel containing the pool. It is a warehouse-type facility with no radiological containment, and they're actually approaching nuclear criticality levels in the pool. They have to take extraordinary measures to prevent nuclear criticality in the pool. Metal sleeves between fuel assemblies that are impregnated with boron to absorb neutrons, boric acid dissolved in the pool water to prevent nuclear chain reactions in these so-called spent fuel assemblies. And it's just a huge risk of losing that cooling water supply in the pool acutely, suddenly through a drain down, whether that's an intentional attack taking place or an accident like dropping a heavy load in the pool and punching a hole in the floor. Once you lose the cooling water, the worst case scenario is a partial drain down, where the water is in the bottom of the pool, but the fuel is exposed above the water level. Very quickly, that fuel is going to reach the ignition temperature of the zirconium metal cladding of the fuel rods and catch on fire. And once that happens, you are going to have catastrophic releases of things like cesium-137 into the environment, because again, there is no radioactive containment structure over the pool. It's a warehouse type facility.
In the original plans, the notion was that we would be taking used fuel out of the pools and sending them off to a geologic repository. But because that has not happened to date, the pools are getting full and in fact over full. So we're really going beyond design specifications for storing fuel this way. We're also using high burnup fuel. Can you make any comments about that and the dangers that that adds?
It's a part of the greed-driven philosophy of the nuclear power industry and its complicit regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They call it high burnup fuel. It means it's more enriched in uranium-235 content. That's the fissile material in uranium fuel used in reactors to generate heat and electricity by splitting those atoms. And they've enriched it with more of the uranium-235 just so that they can squeeze more electricity out of atomic reactors for a longer period between refueling outages, because when they come down to refuel, they're not making electricity, they're not selling electricity and making a killing. And so they try to keep those reactors operating for as long as possible by boosting the uranium-235 content. So what does that irradiated nuclear fuel look like when it comes out of the reactor at high burnup? It's more radioactive than the previously so-called low burnup fuel. It's more thermally hot, which means it needs to spend more time in the cooling pool, the risks there. And there's real questions, and we do not, as a society, have the answers. How is the metal cladding of high burnup fuel going to perform over time? And irradiated nuclear fuel remains hazardous forever into the future. I mean, 1 million years or more. Some of the radioactive poisons in high-level radioactive waste remain poisonous, have to be isolated from the environment. The first line of defense for isolating it from the environment is the actual ceramic pellets of uranium. The next line of defense after that is this exceedingly thin-walled metal zirconium cladding on the fuel rods. Those pellets and that cladding are under tremendous duress, and very likely we're going to see fuel failures with this fuel over short periods of time.
It certainly paints a bleak picture for Indian Point and the history of its difficulties with various malfunctions. But what can we actually do about it? What difference can people make?
Well, the good news in New York State is that Governor Cuomo and Attorney General Schneiderman are doing really good work to try to close down the Indian Point reactors. So we've talked a bit about Governor Cuomo and his responses to all these accidents and incidents and spills and leaks. Attorney General Schneiderman has really been a lead in the entire country on challenging what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission previously called nuclear waste confidence, and they've changed the name because it's gotten such a bad reputation, to another phrase, continued storage of spent nuclear fuel. Just very recently, the Attorney General's Office of New York led a state coalition along with an Indian tribe, several states, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and the Prairie Island Indian Community of Minnesota in coalition, along with an environmental coalition, including Beyond Nuclear and many other groups, have challenged this, what we call nuke waste con game. And that's been real leadership, that it is not safe in the pools. That's what we're saying. It is not safe in the dry casks. There may never be a repository and dump site for this waste to go away too. We need to stop making it, and that's a part of essentially the state of New York's argument right now.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about this term waste confidence?
This phrase, nuclear waste confidence, was coined by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 1984 because it's a very Orwellian phrase. And what the NRC said was, we are confident that the waste is stored safely at the reactor sites, in pools, and now these outdoor dry casks, and that will continue for centuries. This safe storage, they say, at the reactor sites on the edge of the Hudson River, 24 miles from the city limits of New York. But they're also confident that when needed, they don't even put a date certain on it, when needed, a dump site will open and the waste can leave a place like Indian Point and go to this fictional dump site that we don't have, and we haven't had after 60 years of commercial nuclear power radioactive waste generation in this country. And there's not one in sight. In fact, the U.S. Department of Energy has said recently the earliest date we could open such a dump site now is 2048. decades from now. So this false confidence of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is resulting in tremendous risks building up at a place like Indian Point, in the pools, in the dry casks, so near to earthquake fault lines and natural gas pipelines, and you name the security risk at Indian Point. And the radioactive waste is some of the most vulnerable radioactive risks at any nuclear power plant because of how it's stored.
And to summarize, you use the term a con game, and I think it's, to me, emblematic of the fact that although nuclear power is sold to us as being clean and green and low carbon, that in fact there is a bit of a confidence game going on, that anything that leaves behind the most dangerous elements known to mankind that will remain dangerous for millions of years, how in the world can you say that that's a clean energy source?
And you had asked what people in New York can do. So residents of New York State, this feels good. Make a phone call, send an email to Attorney General Schneiderman and thank him and his staff for their leadership at the national level for addressing this nuke waste con game and shining a very bright light on these risks at Indian Point, in the pools, in the dry casks. We need to stop making radioactive waste at Indian Point.
Well, hopefully we'll find that in the near future the facility will be closed down.
And folks can follow up with a phone call to Governor Cuomo and thank him and his administration for calling for the shutdown of Indian Point, for traveling up to Indian Point right away in May of 2015 when the transformer fire took place and the oil spill into the Hudson River took place. He was on the ground. He was there calling attention to these risks.
Well, good. Well, I hope that people will take those actions and really thank and encourage our elected leaders to continue to promote for our well-being and public health.
Folks can follow up by calling, for example, the U.S. senators from New York. So New York senator is going to be the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, in the U.S. Senate, and wields a lot of power, and has recently said that, well, if we don't have ready replacement for Indian Point, then we have to keep it operating. Well, it's been shown time and time again that Indian Point is not needed for the electricity of New York City or the state in general. There are alternatives to Indian Point's electricity supply. So given the risks, the senator needs to be educated that it's just too risky and there are ready alternatives and it's time to shut it down.
Well, thank you so much.
There's a place called Indian Point. It's an unsafe nuclear joint, threatens everybody, and it poisons everything. It's first on a public safety list. It's a target for a terrorist. We have a chance to shut it down. This is why we sing. This is your part. It goes like, kiss your ass goodbye. Kiss your ass goodbye. If we don't close Indian Point, kiss your ass goodbye. Kiss your ass goodbye. Kiss your ass goodbye. If we don't close Indian Point, kiss your ass goodbye.